The first sign that something was wrong wasn't the email. It was the silence. In 32 years at Northbridge Infrastructure, I had learned that offices have a rhythm, like breathing. Phones ringing, keyboards clicking, the low murmur of project managers arguing over schedules and budgets. Even on stressful days, the building always felt alive. But that Tuesday morning, the moment I stepped out of the elevator onto the 21st floor, something felt different. Too quiet. A few people glanced at me and quickly looked away. Others suddenly found reasons to study their computer screens. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from the break room, but no one stood there laughing the way they usually did. It felt like walking into a room where a conversation had just ended the moment you arrived. I slowed slightly, my heels tapping against the polished marble floor. That uneasy feeling in my chest tightened. By the time I reached my office, the email was already waiting. Subject, Executive Meeting, 9 a.m. from Daniel Cross. No agenda. No explanation. Just a calendar invite. I checked the time. 8:47. 13 minutes. Enough time to know something unpleasant was about to happen. My name is Eloan Carter. Most people call me Wen, pronounced like Wen, which has saved me a lifetime of awkward corrections. I'm 54 years old, and until that morning, I had spent 32 years working for Northbridge Infrastructure in Denver, Colorado. When I first joined the company, Ronald Reagan was still president and Northbridge operated out of a modest brick building with peeling paint and a single conference room that doubled as the lunchroom. Back then I was just a junior project analyst with thick glasses, a nervous voice, and an obsession with spreadsheets. But numbers made sense to me. Projects made sense. Construction timelines, logistics chains, regulatory approvals. They were puzzles, and I loved puzzles. Over 3 decades I climbed my way up through the company. Not with flashy presentations or political maneuvering, but by doing something much simpler. I solved problems before anyone else even noticed them. Eventually I became director of project controls, the person responsible for keeping our massive infrastructure developments on schedule and within budget. It wasn't glamorous work, but when you're overseeing hundreds of millions of dollars in construction, the quiet person watching the numbers often matters more than the loud person making promises. For most of my career, Northbridge felt less like a company and more like a living organism. Everyone depended on everyone else, and I understood its nervous system better than almost anyone, which is why what happened next felt so surreal. At exactly 8:59, I walked into the executive conference room. The blinds were full drawn, casting bright rays of morning light across the long walnut table. Daniel Cross sat at the head. Our new chief operations officer. 38 years old. Perfect haircut. Perfect suit. Perfect confidence. He had joined Northbridge 6 months earlier after a flashy career consulting for venture capital firms. People described him as a disruptor. I had another word for it. Reckless. 2 HR representatives sat near him, along with our legal counsel. The moment I saw HR, my stomach sank. Daniel smiled when I entered. Not a warm smile. A polished one. The kind you see on politicians during debates. Eloan, he said smoothly. Thanks for coming. I sat down slowly. The leather chair felt colder than usual. What's this about? I asked. Daniel folded his hands. Organizational restructuring. The phrase hung in the air like a bad smell. I'd heard those words before. They almost never meant anything good. Daniel continued speaking in the calm, rehearsed tone of someone delivering a presentation he had practiced in front of a mirror. Northbridge is entering a new phase of strategic growth. With that comes a need to modernize leadership structures and introduce fresh operational perspectives. I stared at him. He hadn't actually said anything yet. Daniel, I said quietly, what are you trying to tell me? He leaned back slightly. Eloan, after reviewing departmental performance and leadership alignment, we've decided to offer you an early retirement package. For a moment, I genuinely thought I had misheard him. Early retirement? Yes. I'm 54. And you've had a very successful career, he said smoothly. One of the HR representatives slid a folder across the table. Inside were several documents. Severance package. Benefits continuation. Retirement transition support. It was all very professional. Very generous, even. But that didn't change what it really was. A dismissal. You're forcing me out, I said. Daniel tilted his head slightly. I wouldn't frame it that way. How would you frame it? He gave a small shrug. Sometimes companies need new energy. The room felt smaller. The quiet hum of the air conditioning suddenly seemed louder. And you think I'm old energy? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Then he said something I will never forget. Some people reach a point where they simply can't keep up with modern business dynamics. The words were gentle, but the meaning wasn't. For 32 years I had kept this company running through economic crashes, regulatory crises, and projects that nearly collapsed. And now this man, who had been here for 6 months, was telling me I couldn't keep up. I felt heat rising in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. Who approved this? I asked. The board supports the restructuring. That answer told me everything. He had already positioned the narrative. I glanced at the documents again. The package was generous. Very generous. Which meant something else. They wanted me to leave quietly. No complaints. No legal battle. Just sign the papers and disappear. Daniel leaned forward slightly. I hope we can make this transition smooth, he said. I looked at him carefully. Then I did something he didn't expect. I smiled. Of course, I said. His eyebrows lifted slightly. He had expected anger. Maybe tears. But not calm acceptance. I signed the papers. The pen felt strangely heavy in my hand. 32 years reduced to 3 signatures. When I finished, I closed the folder and slid it back. Daniel stood. We appreciate everything you've contributed to Northbridge. I stood as well. And as I walked toward the door, he added one final comment. A comment he probably thought was harmless. Sometimes stepping aside is the best way to make room for progress. I paused briefly. Then I said quietly without turning around. Progress is a wonderful thing, Daniel. And I left the room. My office looked exactly the same as it had that morning. The same stacks of project files. The same framed blueprint from the first highway expansion project I helped oversee. The same coffee mug that said trust the data. I closed the door and sat down. For the first time since the meeting, the reality finally settled in. 32 years. Gone. A strange mix of emotions swirled inside me. Anger. Sadness. Disbelief. But beneath all of that, something else. Clarity. Because Daniel Cross had made a mistake. A big one. He thought he had removed a problem. What he had actually removed was the only person who truly understood the system keeping his ambitious expansion projects from collapsing. The same system I had personally designed years ago. A system so complex that even our best analysts struggled to navigate it without my guidance. And the biggest project Northbridge had ever attempted, an $800 million infrastructure development outside Phoenix, was about to enter its most fragile stage. Without me. I packed my things slowly. One box. Then another. As I carried them out to the elevator, a few co-workers approached awkwardly. I heard what happened, one whispered. I'm so sorry. I smiled politely. It's all right. But as the elevator doors closed and the building disappeared behind me, a quiet thought formed in the back of my mind. Daniel believed he had forced me into retirement. But sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is remove the one person holding your entire system together. And I had a feeling it wouldn't take very long for Northbridge to realize exactly what it had lost. The first morning after 32 years of routine felt strangely quiet. I woke up at 5:30 a.m., exactly the same time I had every weekday for most of my adult life. My body didn't know that my career had ended the day before. For a moment, lying in bed, I forgot. Then the realization came back like a cold wave. I had nowhere to go. The Denver morning light was just beginning to glow faintly through the curtains. Outside, the city was waking up. I could hear the distant rumble of traffic on Colfax Avenue and the low whistle of wind brushing the bare branches of the maple tree outside my window. Normally by now I would already be halfway through my first cup of coffee, reviewing overnight project updates before heading into the office. Instead, the house felt still. Too still. I walked into the kitchen and made coffee out of habit. The smell filled the room, rich and familiar, but it didn't bring the usual sense of focus. For the first time in decades, I was untethered. I sat at the small wooden table by the window and stared into the steam rising from my mug. 32 years. I thought about the countless late nights in the office, the weekends spent reviewing schedules, the projects that nearly collapsed until my team and I pulled them back from the edge. All of it ended with a folder slid across a table. And a polite smile. The part that bothered me most wasn't losing the job. It was the why. Daniel Cross had never liked me. That much had been clear since his first month. But disliking someone wasn't enough reason to remove a senior director who had held the operational spine of the company together for decades. No, there was something else. Something I hadn't seen yet. And puzzles had always been my specialty. 2 weeks passed. At first, I tried to keep my distance from everything connected to Northbridge. I went on long walks around City Park, read books I had been putting off for years, even attempted gardening in the backyard. But my mind kept drifting back. To spreadsheets. To timelines. To the enormous Phoenix Corridor expansion project. The $800 million development Daniel had been obsessively pushing forward. That project was complicated in ways most executives didn't understand. It involved dozens of contractors, multiple state regulatory agencies, complex supply chains, and an operational monitoring system I had personally designed nearly 8 years earlier. The Project Control Matrix. That system tracked thousands of variables simultaneously: materials shipments, labor allocations, permitting deadlines, safety compliance metrics. If one piece slipped out of alignment, the entire timeline could begin unraveling. Which is exactly why Daniel pushing me out 2 months before the Phoenix project entered its most critical phase made no sense. Unless he believed he no longer needed the system, or the person who built it. 3 weeks after my retirement, I met Frank Alvarez for lunch. Frank had been with Northbridge almost as long as I had. He ran logistics operations and knew the company's supply networks better than anyone. We met at a small Mexican restaurant near Union Station, the kind of place where the smell of grilled peppers and warm tortillas filled the air the moment you walked inside. Frank looked uncomfortable the moment he saw me. That told me something immediately. "When?" he said, sliding into the booth across from me. "You look like someone who swallowed a wrench," I replied gently. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Yeah, well." The waitress came by, took our orders, and left. Frank leaned forward slightly. "I didn't know he was going to do that to you." "I believe you," I said. Frank had never been good at lying. "But you know why he did it?" Frank's eyes dropped to the table. That silence told me everything. "You do know," I said quietly. Frank sighed. "It started about 4 months ago," he said. "Daniel began bringing in outside consultants." "That's normal." "Not these ones." "What do you mean?" "They weren't reviewing operations," Frank said. "They were asking very specific questions about the Phoenix project." My fingers tightened slightly around my glass of water. "What kind of questions?" "Budget authorizations. Vendor contracts. Internal approval pathways. In other words, they were mapping the system. The system I built. Did they talk to me?" I asked. Frank gave a small, bitter laugh. "No. That's the strange part." Which meant Daniel had deliberately kept them away from me. Who helped them? Frank hesitated. And in that hesitation, my stomach tightened. Because suddenly I already knew the answer. "Just say it," I told him. Frank exhaled slowly. "Lena." For a moment, the noise of the restaurant seemed to fade. Lena Hart. My deputy. The woman I had mentored for nearly 10 years. The person I had personally recommended for promotion twice. She helped them access the internal project frameworks, Frank said quietly. Did she know what Daniel was planning? I don't know. But the way he said it told me he suspected she did. That hurt more than Daniel's betrayal. Daniel was predictable. Ambitious men often are. But Lena, that felt personal. When I got home that evening, I poured a glass of wine and sat on the back patio. The Denver sunset painted the sky in deep orange and purple, the Rocky Mountains silhouetted in the distance like quiet giants. I tried to make sense of what Frank had told me. Daniel had consultants mapping the operational systems. Lena helped them access internal data. Then 2 months later, I was forced out. It didn't take a genius to connect the dots. Daniel believed he had successfully replaced the system I built, which meant he thought he no longer needed me. I almost laughed. Because Daniel had misunderstood something fundamental about the project control matrix. It wasn't just software. It was a living framework built on thousands of interconnected decisions. And some of its most critical logic structures existed only in one place. My head. A month later, the first phone call came. It was Frank again. His voice sounded tense. When something's wrong. What happened? The Phoenix Project. My heartbeat slowed slightly. What about it? Schedules are slipping. That's normal during early deployment. This isn't normal. I sat up in my chair. How bad? Frank hesitated. 3 major contractor delays in the same week. That was unusual. Did the Matrix flag it? It's producing error reports. What kind of errors? He exhaled. The kind nobody understands. I leaned back slowly. Exactly the kind of errors the system would generate if someone changed core operational parameters without understanding the cascading consequences. Who's reviewing them? Daniel hired consultants to fix it. I almost smiled. And they can't figure it out. Of course they couldn't. Because the Matrix wasn't just software. It was strategy embedded in code. Strategy Daniel never bothered to learn. Frank lowered his voice slightly. The board's starting to ask questions. Good, I said quietly. When you sound calm. I am. Because puzzles eventually reveal their patterns. And Daniel Cross had just triggered the first crack in a very large system. Frank, I said gently, tell me something. Did Daniel ever ask how the Phoenix Project stayed on schedule all these years? Frank paused. No. I looked out at the darkening mountains. Then I whispered softly. He's about to learn. Because the most dangerous assumption you can make in business is believing the system will keep working after you remove the person who built it. And the Phoenix Project had only just begun to unravel. 2 months after I left Northbridge, the first Real crack appeared. Not in the company. In Daniel. I didn't see it myself. Not at first. I heard it in Frank's voice. It was a Thursday afternoon when my phone rang. I was standing in the small garden behind my house, trimming the lavender bushes I had neglected for years while working 60-hour weeks. The sun hung low over Denver, warm and bright, and the air carried that crisp mountain scent that always comes after a light breeze moves down from the Rockies. For the first time in decades, my days had become slow, peaceful. But something about that peace still felt temporary, like the quiet before a summer storm. My phone vibrated in my pocket. Frank. I wiped dirt from my hands and answered. Hey, Frank. For a moment, he didn't say anything. That alone told me things had gotten worse. Finally, he spoke. 1. Phoenix. Is slipping. How much? 3 weeks. I straightened slowly. 3 weeks was not a minor delay. On a project that size, 3 weeks could mean millions in penalties. What caused it? That's the problem. No one knows. I could picture the operations floor at Northbridge perfectly. Dozens of analysts staring at glowing monitors, spreadsheets open, dashboards flashing warnings no one fully understood. Is the Matrix flagging anything? Frank gave a short, humorless laugh. Oh, it's flagging plenty. Such as system conflicts, resource allocation failures, permit sequence errors. I nodded slowly. Exactly what I expected. The project control matrix was designed to detect chain reactions. If someone made a change in one part of the system without understanding the ripple effects, the matrix would begin producing conflict reports. Lots of them. Reports that looked like chaos to anyone unfamiliar with the architecture. What did Daniel do? He called an emergency meeting. Of course he did. Daniel was the kind of executive who believed every problem could be solved by putting people in a room and demanding answers. Did the consultants solve it? No. Why not? They say the system logic doesn't make sense. I couldn't help it. I laughed softly. The system made perfect sense if you built it. Frank's voice lowered. When something else happened, Daniel blamed Lena. That caught my attention. Blamed her for what? For giving him bad data. The irony almost made me shake my head. Lena had helped Daniel push me out. And now Daniel needed someone to blame. That was predictable. What did Lena say? Not much, Frank said quietly. But she looked scared. That was interesting. Lena Hart had always been confident, almost aggressively so. Fear didn't suit her. What kind of scared? The kind that makes you think she knows something she shouldn't. After I hung up, I stayed in the garden for a while. The lavender smelled sweet and earthy under the fading sunlight, bees drifting lazily between the purple blossoms. But my mind wasn't in the garden anymore. It was inside the Phoenix Project, running through the structure of the Matrix. The Matrix didn't fail randomly. If it began producing conflict reports, It meant someone had altered a variable that affected multiple systems simultaneously. Budget allocation, vendor scheduling, permit sequencing, or something even more dangerous. Compliance. I went inside and opened my laptop. Not to access company systems. I no longer had that access. But to review my old design documents. I still had copies of the original architecture. The bones of the system. As I scanned through the diagrams, the possibilities began narrowing. There were only a few changes capable of triggering the type of cascade Frank described. One of them involved contractor substitution during a regulatory phase. If Daniel replaced a certified contractor with a cheaper alternative during an active permit sequence, the entire approval chain would collapse, which meant inspections would fail, permits would stall, and the schedule would implode. If that had happened, the delays Frank mentioned were just the beginning. The next call came 3 days later. This time, the number on my phone surprised me. Lena Hart. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. Then I answered. Hello, Lena. There was a long pause before she spoke. It's been a while. Her voice sounded different. Less confident. More careful. Yes, I said calmly. You heard about the Phoenix delays? She said. News travels fast, I replied. I wanted to ask you something. Go ahead. You designed the matrix, right? I did. Well, there's a logic sequence in the contractor allocation module we can't figure out. Of course there was. That module contained the most complicated predictive algorithms in the entire system. Algorithms built to anticipate supply chain disruptions years before anyone else in the industry began using similar tools. What kind of sequence, Lena? It keeps rejecting contractor reassignment requests. There it was. Exactly what I suspected. Which contractor? I asked. That silence told me more than words ever could. Lena, I said quietly. What did Daniel change? I can't discuss internal decisions. I leaned back in my chair. That answer was almost amusing. You called me, Lena. I know. And you're asking about a system you helped Daniel access that he forced me out. Her breathing became slightly uneven. Things aren't how I expected them to be. That sentence carried more weight than she probably intended. What did you expect? That he would modernize operations. And instead, he's cutting corners. There it was. The real problem. Daniel wasn't just incompetent. He was impatient. Ambitious executives often believe they can accelerate complex systems simply by demanding faster results. But infrastructure projects don't work like that. Neither do regulatory frameworks. What contractor did he replace? I asked again. Lena hesitated. Then she whispered the name. The moment I heard it, my stomach tightened. That company had been removed from our approved vendor list years ago. Safety violations. Compliance failures. Daniel had replaced a certified contractor with a cheaper one during a regulatory phase. Exactly the scenario that would trigger the matrix. Lena, I said slowly. Yes. Do you know why the system keeps rejecting your changes? No. Because it's protecting the company. The silence that followed was heavy. The system recognizes that contractor as non-compliant, I explained. It will continue rejecting the change. But Daniel already approved the contract. I closed my eyes briefly. That was worse than I thought. If Daniel had already signed the contract, Northbridge could be facing a major regulatory violation. Lena, I said quietly, does the board know about this? No, of course they didn't. Daniel had likely buried the decision under layers of operational reports. What should we do? She asked. I took a slow breath. The truth was simple. If the regulatory agency discovered the contractor substitution, the Phoenix project could be shut down. An $800 million disaster. But none of that was my responsibility anymore. Daniel had made that very clear. Lena, I said finally, you should probably talk to Daniel. She let out a small, bitter laugh. I tried. And he told me to fix the system. Of course he did. Daniel believed problems existed to be solved. Not understood. One, Lena said softly. Could you help us? I looked out the window at the Denver skyline glowing in the evening light. For 32 years I had solved Northbridge's problems. Quietly. Efficiently. Without recognition. But things had changed. You should talk to the board, because the moment regulators discover that contractor change, the project could collapse. Lena was silent for a long time. Then she whispered something that made my heart sink. It's already collapsing. 2 days later, Frank called again. When you won't believe this. What happened? The Phoenix inspection failed. I closed my eyes. How bad? Bad enough that the state suspended the next construction phase. That meant penalties. Massive penalties. And Daniel? Frank let out a breath. He's furious. About the contractor? No. About what? He's blaming the system. Of course he was. Because admitting the real problem would mean admitting something far worse. That his decision, not the system, caused the failure. Frank lowered his voice. The board scheduled an emergency review meeting tomorrow. My fingers tightened slightly around the phone. What kind of review? The kind where executives start losing their jobs. I stared out the window at the distant mountains, their peaks glowing under the last light of sunset. Daniel Cross had forced me into early retirement. But now the system he thought he controlled was beginning to unravel. And very soon, the board would start asking the one question Daniel never wanted them to ask. Who actually understood how to fix it? When a system begins to fail, it rarely collapses all at once. It starts with small fractures. A delay here. A failed inspection there. A contractor suddenly refusing to show up on site. Each problem by itself seems manageable. But underneath, pressure builds. And eventually the structure begins to feel unstable. That's exactly what was happening inside Northbridge. I could feel it without even being there. 3 days after the Phoenix inspection failure, Denver woke to a heavy spring rain. The kind that drummed steadily against the windows and wrapped the city in a cool gray haze. I was standing in my kitchen, watching water slide down the glass while my coffee brewed. The smell of roasted beans filled the air. 6 months ago, mornings like this would have meant a long commute through wet streets, construction updates waiting in my inbox, and a dozen project managers asking for guidance before noon. Now there was only quiet. But that quiet didn't last. My phone buzzed against the countertop. The name on the screen made my eyebrows rise slightly. Arthur Mendelson, Northbridge board member. Arthur had been on the board for nearly 15 years. Old school. Sharp. The kind of man who rarely called anyone directly unless something serious was happening. I answered. Good morning, Arthur. Eloan, he said in his gravelly voice. I hope I didn't wake you. Not at all. There was a pause. Then he said something interesting. You've probably heard about Phoenix. Yes, I said calmly. What do you think? I smiled faintly. Arthur Mendelson never asked questions he didn't already have theories about. I think the project is experiencing structural management failure, I said. Arthur chuckled softly. That's a polite way of putting it. I leaned against the counter. What happened at the board meeting? Daniel insisted the delays are caused by outdated internal systems. Of course he did. And the board believes that? Some do. And you? Arthur's voice lowered slightly. I believe the system worked perfectly for 8 years. Yes, it did. And it started failing 2 months after you were forced out. I didn't respond. Sometimes silence is the best answer. Arthur continued. Eloan, did Daniel make any major changes before you left? I thought about Lena's phone call. About the contractor substitution. I don't have access to internal decisions anymore, I said carefully. That's not what I asked. Arthur was clever. He understood that direct questions often reveal more than accusations. I exhaled slowly. If a certified contractor was replaced during an active regulatory phase. Arthur didn't let me finish. The permit chain would collapse. Yes. The rain tapped softly against the windows as the implications settled. Arthur spoke again. You designed the operational matrix. Yes. Could it prevent that type of mistake? It tries. Tries. The system rejects contractor substitutions that violate compliance sequences. Arthur went quiet. Then he asked the question I had been expecting. What happens if someone overrides the system? I looked out the window at the gray Denver skyline. Then the system stops protecting the project. And gravity takes over. Arthur laughed. That's a very engineering answer. It's also the correct one. There was another pause. Then Arthur said something that made the room feel suddenly colder. Eloan, did you know Daniel approved a new contractor 6 weeks ago? Yes. That single word hung in the air like thunder before a storm. Arthur didn't speak for several seconds. Finally he said quietly, You already knew. I suspected. How? Because the system started producing conflict reports. Arthur inhaled slowly. Daniel told the board those reports were software errors. They're not errors. What are they? Warnings. Arthur's voice dropped to a whisper. Really? Later that afternoon, I went for a walk through Washington Park. The rain had stopped, leaving the air fresh and cool. Water clung to the leaves of the tall cottonwood trees, and the scent of wet earth drifted through the park. Joggers moved along the gravel paths, dogs splashed through puddles, and children laughed somewhere near the lake. Life moving forward. Calm. Normal. But my mind wasn't in the park. It was in a boardroom on the 21st floor of Northbridge. Because I knew exactly what would happen next. The board would begin asking questions Daniel couldn't answer. Why had the contractor been replaced? Why did the system reject the change? Why had the compliance inspection failed? And most importantly, who actually understood the system well enough to fix it? The answer to that last question was obvious. Even to Daniel. That evening my phone rang again. Frank. His voice sounded more tense than usual. When it just got worse. What happened? 2 more contractors pulled out. I stopped walking. Why? They say the project timeline is unstable. Of course they did. Contractors can sense instability faster than executives. How bad are the delays now? Frank hesitated. 5 weeks. That meant millions in penalties already. And regulators? They scheduled a full compliance review. My stomach tightened slightly. That was serious. A compliance review could freeze the entire project. Frank lowered his voice. And Daniel is panicking. I almost felt sorry for him. What is he doing? He brought in 3 more consulting firms. I laughed softly. Consultants were excellent at one thing. Billing by the hour. What about Lena? Frank hesitated. She's different. How so? Quiet. Nervous. That didn't surprise me. Because Lena understood something Daniel still didn't. The system wasn't malfunctioning. It was responding exactly as it was designed to. Frank, I said gently, do you remember the day Daniel forced me into retirement? Of course. What did he say? Frank thought for a moment. Something about fresh energy. I smiled faintly. Yes. And something else. Frank exhaled. He said some people can't keep up with modern business. That's right. I watched a flock of geese glide across the lake, their wings cutting smoothly through the cool evening air. Frank, I said quietly, tell me something. Has Daniel asked about me yet? Frank paused. Then he said something that made me smile. No, not I'm aware of. Really? Frank let out a short laugh. Because he's still convinced he can fix this without you. I nodded slowly. Of course he was. Daniel Cross was the kind of man who believed problems existed only until someone strong enough solved them. He didn't understand something fundamental. Some systems can't be bullied into working. They have rules. Like gravity. Ignore them long enough. And eventually the structure collapses. That night, just before midnight, my phone buzzed again. An unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it. But something told me not to. I answered. Hello. For a moment, there was only silence. Then a voice I hadn't heard in few months spoke quietly on the other end. Eloan, it's Daniel. I leaned back slowly in my chair. The man who forced me into early retirement. Calling me. At midnight. And for the first time since he arrived at Northbridge. Daniel Cross sounded uncertain. I didn't respond immediately. Not because I didn't want to, but because timing matters. Some moments only happen once, and if you rush them, you miss their true weight. 6 months earlier, that name meant authority. Control. The man who believed he had the power to decide whether I still belonged at Northbridge. Now he was calling me after midnight. That alone told me something had gone very wrong. For a moment, there was nothing but faint background noise on the other end, like someone breathing into the receiver while deciding how to begin. Then Daniel spoke. Eloan. His voice sounded different from the man who had sat across from me in the conference room months earlier. Less polished. Less certain. Another pause. Then he cleared his throat. I apologize for calling so late. That's all right. Silence again. Daniel Cross had always been the kind of man who filled rooms with confident speeches. But right now, he sounded like someone trying to navigate unfamiliar territory. Finally, he said it. We're having some difficulties with the Phoenix project. I couldn't help it. A small smile crept across my face. Difficulties? Yes. What kind? You've probably heard about the inspection delay. Yes. And the contractor issues. Yes. And the scheduling conflicts. Yes. Daniel exhaled slowly. Well, things have become more complicated than expected. That was an impressive understatement. How complicated? There was a long pause before he answered. Regulators have opened a compliance review. I leaned back in my chair. That meant the situation was worse than Frank had described. A compliance review could freeze the entire project. How unfortunate, I said. Daniel didn't respond, because we both knew what he was really calling about. But he still hadn't said it. Not yet. I've brought in several consulting teams, he continued. And they haven't been able to identify the root cause. Of course they hadn't, because the root cause wasn't technical. It was human. So why are you calling me? The silence on the line stretched for several seconds. When Daniel finally spoke again, the words came slower. Because you designed the system. There it was. The admission he never thought he would make. And we were hoping you might be willing to consult. Consult. The word almost made me laugh. 6 months earlier, I had been director of project controls. Now he was offering me a consulting role. Daniel, I said gently, do you remember the last conversation we had in the conference room? Yes. What did you tell me? His voice became slightly tight. I don't recall the exact wording. You said some people reach a point where they can't keep up with modern business. Daniel didn't answer. You also said the company needed fresh energy, I continued. And now you're asking the person you forced into retirement to fix your biggest project. The quiet on the line became heavy. Finally, Daniel said something honest. The situation has evolved. That made me laugh. A short, quiet laugh that echoed softly in the dark room. Yes, it certainly has, I said. The next morning I woke early, not out of habit this time, but of curiosity. Daniel had asked for help. But he hadn't yet realized the most important truth. Help always comes with terms. And I had spent 6 months thinking about exactly what those terms should be. At 10 that morning, my phone rang again. This time the caller was Arthur Mendelson. Eloan, he said. Did Daniel contact you? Arthur let out a long breath. I suspected he would. He sounded nervous. He should be. Arthur's tone carried the weight of someone who had spent decades watching corporate crises unfold. The compliance review has escalated, he continued. How bad? The regulators are investigating the contractor substitution. That confirmed my suspicions. Has Daniel explained why he replaced the contractor? Not clearly. Of course he hadn't. Because the real explanation might be something far worse than incompetence. Arthur lowered his voice. Eloan, we've also discovered something else. The contractor Daniel approved is linked to a consulting firm he used at his previous company. I closed my eyes briefly. There it was. The piece that turned a management failure into something much darker. You're saying he had a prior relationship with them? It appears so. And the board didn't know. Arthur sighed. The optics are terrible. Optics, the polite corporate word for potential corruption. If regulators believed Daniel had manipulated contractor approvals to benefit associates, the Phoenix project wouldn't just collapse. The entire company could face investigation. Arthur, I said quietly, Daniel doesn't understand the gravity of what he's done. I think he's starting to. He paused. Then he asked the question I knew was coming. If the board asked you to return temporarily, would you? I looked out the window at the Denver skyline glowing under the bright morning sun. For 32 years, I had given Northbridge everything. And the man currently running operations had dismissed me like outdated equipment. But Northbridge itself wasn't Daniel. It was thousands of workers, engineers, and contractors who depended on the company staying strong. Yes, I said slowly. I would consider it. Arthur sounded relieved. Good. But under certain conditions. Okay, what conditions? I want full operational authority over the Phoenix project. Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed softly. You drive a hard bargain. I build systems that work. Sure you do. He exhaled slowly. I'll bring it to the board. That afternoon I received a text message. From Lena. Can we talk? I stared at the message for a long moment before replying. Sure. She called immediately. Her voice sounded fragile. 1. I owe you an apology. You sure do, I said calmly. Lena took a shaky breath. I shouldn't have helped Daniel. Why did you? I thought he was going to modernize operations. That's what he told everyone. Yes. 1. And now, her voice dropped. Now I think he's trying to hide something. I leaned forward slightly. What do you mean? I saw the contractor approval documents, she said. The numbers don't make sense. How so? The contractor bid was significantly higher than the certified vendor we originally selected. That was interesting. So Daniel chose the more expensive option? Did he explain why? No at all. That confirmed what Arthur had suspected. This wasn't just a bad decision. It might be something worse. 1. I'm scared, Lena whispered. Why? Because if regulators investigate, they'll see my name on the system access logs. Yes, they would. You helped Daniel access the system that replaced me. I know. And now you're asking for help. I let the silence stretch just long enough for her to feel it. Then I said something she probably didn't expect. Come clean to the board. What? Tell them everything. Daniel will destroy me. He won't, because he's about to be far too busy trying to save himself. That evening, my phone rang again. Daniel. This time I answered immediately. Eloan. Yes, Daniel. I spoke with the board today. And they're considering bringing you back temporarily. I smiled faintly. I know. You know? Yes. Daniel hesitated. Then he asked the question he had been avoiding. What would it take for you to help us? I leaned back in my chair, watching the Denver sunset paint the sky in deep shades of gold and crimson. For 6 months, Daniel Cross believed he had the power. Now he was asking permission. And that was the moment I had been waiting for. It's very simple, I said. What is? If I return, I run the Phoenix Project. Daniel inhaled slowly. That's a major authority shift. And if I say no? I smiled softly. Then gravity takes over. There was a long silence on the line. Because Daniel finally understood something he hadn't before. He didn't have the leverage anymore. I did. The next morning, Denver woke under a pale blue sky. Spring sunlight spilled across the skyline, reflecting off the glass towers downtown like nothing unusual had happened. But inside the headquarters of Northbridge Development, the atmosphere was different. Heavy. Tense. Because at 10 a.m., the board of directors had scheduled an emergency meeting. And for the first time in 6 months, I was walking back into the building. The revolving doors spun slowly as I stepped into the marble lobby. The smell of polished stone and fresh coffee filled the air. For 32 years, this building had been my second home. Every hallway, every elevator, every conference room. I knew them the way a structural engineer knows the load paths of a building they designed. Nothing about the space had changed. But the way people looked at me had. The receptionist's eyes widened slightly. Ms. Vale. I smiled politely. Good morning, Teresa. She stood quickly. I didn't know you were coming today. That makes 2 of us. That wasn't entirely true. Arthur had called late the previous night. The board wanted me present. Not as a guest. As a solution. The elevator ride to the 21st floor was quiet. But the silence inside that small steel box gave my mind room to think. 6 months earlier, I had left this building carrying a cardboard box with 32 years of memories inside it. Daniel Cross had stood in the conference room explaining why the company needed fresh energy. Now that same company was asking the person he dismissed to fix the crisis he created. Life has a way of balancing equations. When the elevator doors opened, the tension in the hallway was almost visible. Several senior managers stood near the boardroom doors, speaking in low voices. They stopped when they saw me. Frank was the first to react. 1. His voice carried both relief and disbelief. You actually came. I smiled. Good morning, Frank. He shook his head. I never thought I'd see this day. You might see several interesting things today. Frank chuckled nervously. I'm counting on it. Across the hallway, I noticed Lena standing near the windows. She looked pale. When our eyes met, she nodded quietly. It was the look of someone who knew the storm had finally arrived. At exactly 10 a.m., the boardroom doors opened. Arthur Mendelsohn stood inside. Eloan, he said warmly. Please come in. The boardroom looked exactly the way I remembered. A long walnut table. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Denver. 10 leather chairs around the table. 9 of them already occupied. The 10th belonged to Daniel Cross. He stood near the far end of the room. And for the first time since I had met him, Daniel looked smaller. Not physically, but in presence. Confidence radiates when someone believes they control the room. Daniel no longer had that confidence. Arthur gestured toward a chair near the center. Please sit. I did. The room fell silent. Arthur folded his hands on the table. Thank you all for attending this emergency session. His voice carried the steady authority of someone used to making difficult decisions. As everyone knows, the Phoenix Project has entered a critical compliance review. Several board members nodded. Arthur continued. The delays, contractor substitution, and regulatory flags have created serious financial and legal exposure for Northbridge. No one disagreed, because the numbers were ugly. Millions in delays, possible regulatory fines, and the risk of reputational damage. Arthur turned slightly toward Daniel. Mr. Cross, the board has reviewed the internal reports regarding your decision to replace the certified contractor. Daniel straightened. I've already explained that decision. Arthur nodded slowly. Yes, and your explanation was that the replacement contractor offered improved scheduling flexibility. That's correct. Arthur slid a document across the table. This is the bid comparison. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. Arthur continued. The original certified contractor bid $142 million. He tapped the second number. The contractor you approved bid $157 million. Several board members shifted in their seats. Arthur raised an eyebrow. That is not a cost improvement. Daniel's voice sharpened. The timeline advantages justified the increase. Arthur didn't look convinced. Perhaps. He opened another folder. But this document is more concerning. Daniel frowned. What document? Arthur turned the folder so everyone could see. A financial disclosure from your previous company. The room grew quieter. Arthur spoke carefully. It indicates that the contractor you approved shares financial ties with a consulting firm you worked with before joining Northbridge. Daniel's face flushed. That's irrelevant. Arthur didn't raise his voice. Regulators may disagree. Silence fell across the table. Then Arthur said something that changed the direction of the entire meeting. Which brings us to the operational system that flagged these irregularities. His eyes moved toward me. Elowen designed the project control matrix that detected the contractor conflict. Several board members nodded. Arthur leaned back slightly. And because of that system, we were able to identify the procedural violations before the compliance review escalated further. Daniel looked at me. Not with anger. With realization. He finally understood what he had underestimated. He thought the system was software. But the system was me. Arthur folded his hands again. The board has reached a decision. Every person in the room sat a little straighter. Arthur turned to Daniel. Effective immediately, you are being relieved of your duties as Chief Operations Executive of Northbridge Development. The words landed like a hammer. Daniel's face drained of color. You can't do that. Arthur's voice stayed calm. The board absolutely can. This is political. No, Arthur said quietly. This is governance. Daniel looked around the table. But no one came to his defense. Because the evidence was already on the table. Arthur continued. You will cooperate fully with the regulatory investigation and internal review. Daniel opened his mouth. But Arthur wasn't finished. Your building access will be revoked today. Another pause. Your company vehicle privileges are suspended. And finally, you will remain available for legal inquiry should regulators request further information. Daniel looked like a man who had just watched his entire career collapse in slow motion. Then Arthur turned toward me. Elowen. Yes. The board has unanimously approved a second decision. Every eye in the room shifted toward me. Arthur spoke clearly. Effective immediately, you are being reinstated at Northbridge Development. A few quiet smiles appeared around the table. But Arthur wasn't finished. You will return not as Director of Project Controls. He paused. You will assume the role of Chief Operations Executive. Even Frank inhaled sharply. The room felt suddenly lighter. Arthur continued. You will have full authority to stabilize the Phoenix project. He slid a new document across the table. And you are authorized to initiate a complete internal investigation into procurement decisions, contractor approvals, and operational misconduct. My fingers rested lightly on the paper. Does that include legal action if wrongdoing is discovered? Arthur nodded. Absolutely. His voice hardened slightly. Anyone who violated company policy or regulatory law will face consequences. That meant something important. Not just Daniel. Anyone involved. Arthur leaned back. Northbridge needs to restore integrity to its systems. He looked at me with quiet confidence. And there is only one person in this room who has proven she knows how to do that. I stood slowly. 32 years of experience had prepared me for many moments. But this one still carried weight. I looked around the room. At the board members. At Frank. At Lena. And finally, at Daniel. My voice was calm. Professional. Controlled. The Phoenix project will be stabilized. Several heads nodded. The contractor approval chain will be reviewed immediately. I paused. And any individual who compromised company integrity will face disciplinary action, including legal prosecution if necessary. Daniel lowered his eyes. For the first time since he arrived at Northbridge, he had nothing left to say. I finished with the same quiet tone. Northbridge was built on strong systems. I rested my hand on the folder Arthur had given me. And strong systems correct themselves when something goes wrong. Outside the boardroom windows, the Denver skyline shimmered in the afternoon light. For 6 months, Daniel Cross believed he had forced me out of my career. But he had misunderstood something fundamental. You can remove a person from a position, but you cannot remove the architecture they built. And eventually, every structure returns to the engineer who understands it best. 3 weeks after the board meeting, I called for Daniel Cross to come back to the building. Not as an executive, not as a decision maker, but as a subject of an internal investigation. The difference between those two roles is enormous. When he arrived that morning, security escorted him to the compliance conference room on the 17th floor. Not the executive boardroom. Not the glass offices with skyline views. Just a neutral room used for audits and legal reviews. By the time I walked in, 3 people were already seated at the table. Elaine Porter, our corporate legal counsel. Victor Halstead, head of internal compliance. And Daniel Cross. A digital recorder sat in the center of the table. Daniel looked tired. Not physically exhausted, something deeper than that. The look of a man who had spent the last 3 weeks watching everything he built collapse piece by piece. When I took my seat, he looked up. "Hello, Eloan." His voice carried none of the arrogance I remembered. "Good morning, Daniel." Elaine reached forward and turned on the recorder. This session is part of Northbridge Development's internal compliance investigation regarding the Phoenix project procurement process. Her tone was precise and clinical. This interview will determine whether procurement policies or federal contracting regulations were violated. Daniel nodded slowly. Victor slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of the contractor approval documents. "Mr. Cross," Victor said, "can you explain why the originally approved certified contractor was replaced?" Daniel cleared his throat. "I believed the alternate contractor could accelerate the timeline." Victor opened another page. The alternate contractor's bid was $15 million higher. Daniel shifted in his chair. "Yes. And they lacked 2 regulatory certifications required for the project phase." Daniel looked at me briefly before answering. "I believed those certifications could be obtained during construction." Victor's voice remained calm. "That is not permitted under state infrastructure regulations." Daniel said nothing. Victor turned another page. "This document shows that the contractor you approved has a consulting agreement with Brightcore Advisory." Daniel's jaw tightened. Brightcore, the consulting firm he had worked with before joining Northbridge. Victor continued. "You previously served as a strategic advisor to Brightcore." "Yes. And Brightcore has financial participation in the contractor you selected." Daniel finally spoke. "That relationship was disclosed." Elaine shook her head slightly. "It was disclosed after the contractor was approved." That distinction mattered. In corporate governance, timing can mean the difference between oversight and misconduct. The room grew quiet. Then I spoke. "Daniel." He looked at me again. "Yes. When you approved the contractor, did you know about Brightcore's financial interest?" His eyes dropped to the table. "Yes." Victor wrote something down. Elaine's expression remained neutral. But legally, that answer changed everything. Because now the situation had moved from poor judgment into conflict of interest violation. The investigation continued for 2 more hours. By the end, the facts were clear. Daniel had approved a contractor with financial ties to a consulting firm he previously worked with, failed to disclose that relationship before the approval, overrode the project control system designed to prevent compliance conflicts. None of those actions were criminal on their own. But combined, they created a serious breach of corporate governance. When the interview ended, Elaine turned off the recorder. Daniel sat quietly. Finally, he looked at me. "So what happens now?" I folded my hands on the table. "Northbridge will forward the findings to regulators reviewing the Phoenix project." Daniel nodded slowly. "And internally?" Victor answered that question. "You will be permanently barred from holding any leadership role within Northbridge or its subsidiaries." Daniel exhaled. He had expected that. But there was more. I slid a final document across the table. This is the civil recovery notice. He frowned. What is that? Northbridge will pursue financial recovery for the damages caused by the contractor substitution. His eyes widened slightly. You're suing me? No. I shook my head. The company is recovering losses from all responsible parties. Which includes me. Yes. Daniel leaned back in his chair. For the first time, he looked directly at me. I underestimated you. I smiled faintly.